It's really weird because I'm playing it again and I'm like, God, I remember when this was so hyped up and like everyone was talking about it. And now I'm playing it and it's like this weird old toy that everyone's forgotten about.
It's like an artifact.
Yeah.
Distraction makers.
Full disclosure, I worked on Artifact.
Yay!
Yay. Not directly. I was not part of the studio. I was at PAX West where they had the big unveiling of it. I signed because I was an artist, so I made the art for Sniper here.
And you did how many pieces of art for the
26
game?
Or something.
What's like the one that you're either most proud of or you think most people would know?
Sniper. Yeah.
Is Sniper?
Yeah, I think that's why they picked it.
But you did like the creeps.
I did the creeps, the creeps, the melee creep for both the Radiant and the Dire. I think it's Dire creeps.
Oh.
I don't know, it's been a long time. That being said, I mean, I was a contractor. I have no attachment. No one needs to be worried about like me going,
no inside information here.
Really no inside information. Anything that we have is speculation or just our own research, our own opinions, etc.
Or we're trying to sort of formulate lessons that we can take away from our perceptions of Artifact and why we think it may have not, succeeded, and what as game designers we can learn from some of what's happened here.
Yeah, I think it's been nice. I've been playing a bunch. We've both been playing.
It's been weird to go back and play it again now.
It's really weird because I'm playing it again and I'm like, God, I remember when this was so hyped up and like everyone was talking about it. And now I'm playing it and it's like this weird old toy that everyone's forgotten about.
It's like an artifact.
Yeah. Clearly that was their intention the whole time.
This was all the play, all according to plan.
Such an ironic title. Such a bummer. So yes, we've been playing it a lot, and we're probably going to chunk this into 3 episodes.
Yeah, we're gonna have 3 separate episodes.
Yeah,
that you can watch one at a time, or you could have all 3 of them open and watch all 3 at once.
There you go.
If you wanted to do that,
and
you could understand some of the complexity of Artifact if you do that. Okay, but let's start with a little bit about Richard Garfield. Now, we don't know Richard personally. You've met him.
I shook his hand.
You shook his hand.
Before I knew who he was.
And then you never watched it again?
Yeah, I haven't told him that.
But let's we've done quite a bit of research into him as being big fans of him and his games. And so one of the things that comes up when he talks about his motivations for creating Magic the Gathering is that he plays with a group of gamers who are very math heavy. Yeah. And when a game, the thing that is fun or that he sort of kept experiencing with that group of probably PhD math people, the thing that he kept experiencing was they would easily see the underlying systems of a game and they would sort of solve the gameplay almost immediately. And it was really fun for them to just sort of go through the motions and game the game. Yeah. Right. And so these early motivations for Richard were, how do I make a game that you cannot do that to?
In fact, there's evidence of this too in his, if you're not familiar with Richard, he has tons of talks where he talks about luck and skill, which we'll probably get into. But you can find all sorts of videos of him giving these talks all over. And one of the things that he ends up talking about is he talks about, I think it's Bobby Fischer, but it might have been a different chess champion, or grandmaster. I don't know what they're called.
Yeah.
Okay. And they talk about how you get so good at chess that the initial heuristics or the initial play patterns for the first like 20 turns are pretty much the same.
Right.
And it's not until after you get past those 20 turns that the board state becomes so complex that then it starts to become really interesting. Right. And so having any sort of variance in your game is going to make it so that if you have anyone that is a mathematician or is anyone that is really into that sort of crunchiness, gets straight to that interesting, like you have to rely on heuristics more than you have to off of memorization.
Yeah, and we have an episode about that with Magic and the strategy that emerges from Magic being one that is heuristics based. There are some heuristics in chess too, but there's quite a bit of memorization that can happen there. And who's the guy that proposed random chess?
That's Bobby Fischer.
Bobby Fischer, yeah. Right. So the idea is that before you start playing a game of chess, you would randomize the order of the back row, and then you would proceed a normal game of chess after the back row has been randomized.
Yeah.
And this is something that Richard Garfield has talked about quite a bit in his talk. It's like skill versus luck, basically.
Yeah,
right?
luck versus skill. He talks about that, and he also uses, coincidentally, his own toy game called Rando Chess, which is very... So when he said that, I was like, wait, are these the same things? But they're different examples.
So we can look at Artifact from the perspective of a game that was attempting to be unsolvable. We also, I think, need to understand the context of what Artifact was designed for. And it seems like, at least from an outside perspective, it was designed to be an esport where... they come out of the gate saying there's going to be $1 million tournament. This is happening when Dota is maybe at its highest point or very esports are alive and well at this point. Right now they're on shakier ground, but at the time it was like esports are the future.
Right.
And so I don't know, we don't know what Valve's initial motivations were for making this game. Gabe has come out and said a bit about wanting to make a card game, and then finding out which IP it fits best with.
It's funny because in doing our research, we both watched an insane amount of behind the scenes stuff of Artifact, listened to a ton of old player discussions. I watched a bunch of old matches, and you get so many different conflicting answers where you're hearing different interviews from different developers, and it's like, oh, okay, well, was Richard brought on as a consultant, or did he previously design this game?
Right.
Was this supposed to be just the best card game, or was it based on a Dota thing initially? Was that the goal? There's so many conflicting things, which is why, we can only speculate on any of this.
Right. And I think if we look, compare and contrast a little bit here with some of Richard Garfield's other games, we can look at, Artifact in comparison to Keyforge.
Wow. It's almost like we set this up.
It's like we thought about it ahead of time.
Wow.
We didn't script this, though. We don't script any videos.
What's my line again?
Right. Let me check.
Okay.
Anyway, so when we look at how you make a game unsolvable, there has to be enough variance, enough randomness, enough a wide enough possibility space, and unknown information, things that cannot be determined, non-deterministic.
Yeah.
So when we look at where this non-determinism has been placed in the game design, in Keyforge, it's mostly in the deck building because every deck is unique, right? This is such,
you cannot build a deck in Keyforge, for those that don't know.
Right.
It is an algorithm that poops out a deck based off of different whatever, it has its own structure as far as how it makes the deck, but some decks are going to be worse than others, some are going to be better than others. But the point of the game is you get this random deck, and then it's how you pilot that random deck as far as how well you end up doing.
And they have a retirement system for decks in competitive settings where if a deck is somehow randomly generated to be too powerful, it can't just continue to just dominate the meta. Right. Okay, so when we look at the way Keyforge handles it, it leans, I think, more in a direction of a casual audience in that it can be played competitively, but I don't think that's its first and foremost goal.
Right.
It's that discovery, the same kind of discovery that he tried to achieve with Magic, in that, thinking that, okay, we're going to put these game pieces and they're going to be, one person in 10 will have one Black Lotus or whatever in the early.
It's honestly pretty exciting. In the times that we've played Keyforge,
it's quite interesting.
We'll open a deck and I'll play a deck and be like, man, my deck sucks. But then we'll see your deck and we're like, your deck is insane.
This is crazy. And
you don't know, do you have all 3 blue eyes? Is that are you Kaiba right now?
Right.
Holy shit. And then you want to find out. You want to find out how good your deck is.
I don't know what words you just said, but okay.
Yu-Gi-Oh stuff.
So when you look at that kind of a design philosophy, it's not going to work for a competitively minded game, especially one that wants to be an esport, right?
Right. You
need players to be able to have access to have parity at some point, right? Where Keyforge, you could never have parity. You're just never gonna. It's hard. A sport couldn't work that way, right?
Right.
You couldn't have our team plays with 2 soccer balls and your team plays with 1 or something. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So you need some kind of parity when things are at that high of a competitive level. So where then do you end up putting that unsolvability? Well, you would need to put it into the gameplay,
which is how artifact works.
Right, which
we
is...
think. We're speculating, of course.
Well, I mean,
that is why.
We're speculating as to why, but
Right.
yes, this is where how we think the RNG ended up where it does in Artifact.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about input and output randomness before we get too deep into Artifact, because those are the two different types of randomness that are seen in games.
And I think it's kind of it's somewhat of a spectrum, but they feel like input and output is like almost a hard line. And Artifact somehow blurs this line, but we'll get into that. So input is a random thing that happens before you're making a critical decision. So this is drawing your hand of cards. And output randomness is you make a critical decision, and then there's randomness after you've made the decision. Warhammer is like one of the most obvious uses of that kind of output randomness.
Right.
Is that you can charge with your troops, but you're not sure how well they're going to do until you've already charged with them.
We should probably say, too, just right off the bat, like how the structure of Artifact works. Sure. For those that aren't familiar of it, is that when you start most card games, you draw your hand, your opponent draws your hand, maybe you have a mulligan, and then the game starts, but the board state is empty. In Artifact, when you start your game, every deck you choose 5 heroes, and when you start a game, your board, there's 3 boards, I should say, so there's 3 boards. Each board will have one of your 5 heroes, so you have 3 in total, randomly placed on that board. And so right off the bat, you already have a lot of variance in how you start. You have no control over how that initial board state is.
It starts similarly to maybe how random chess would, right? That the initial board state is outside of your control.
Right. So right off the bat, Artifact, output randomness across the board. You technically have input in your deck construction, but the way it poops everything out is out of your control. So you do not know how that's going to
This
show
is
up.
tough because I actually think that's input randomness, right? In that it's happening before you're making critical decisions.
Yeah,
right?
you're right.
So it's the random deployment of your heroes is very similar to drawing cards.
Yeah, I guess.
Yep. And then
but
also,
you've committed to the board.
Well, you didn't commit.
You didn't commit, but the board is like.
So right, we're not getting to hero deployment.
All
yet.
right.
All right. So this is why I'm saying it's blur. It's a blurred line with Artifact.
Yeah.
Where I think your initial hero deployment is very similar to drawing a hand of cards, right? You have cards in your hand. You have cards now that have been distributed to the board. I think it feels more like output randomness because those you're not protecting those heroes in your hand. They're on the board, right?
Yeah.
So it feels like output randomness, but it's input because you are not making critical decisions yet. I think that if you had agency over where your units are deployed, then it would feel like, okay, well, I wanted to deploy them in different places. Right?
Which
it's so weird.
Which we've talked. I mean, we've played some Artifact Foundry, which, for those that don't know, is basically Artifact 2.0 that eventually got canceled. And that was one of the major things that they changed, is that they actually had it so that not only right in the beginning do you get to choose to deploy your hero in different lanes, but you also get to pick the exact position that hero is going to be in that lane. And a lot of people seem to prefer that at least start to the game, based off of, I'm not saying I did, I'm not saying my preferences, but it seemed like there's quite a few people. Obviously, one of the big things why we're talking about RNG is because that was a big concern that people had about Artifact.
Right.
People generally did not like the feeling of the RNG.
Right. And I think that's what we're sort of attempting to do here is dig down on like why this feels weird, even though the type of randomness that it is probably closer to input randomness than output randomness, because these things are determined before you make critical decisions about what cards am I going to play in these lanes, right? So your heroes are deployed. Their attack directions are chosen, right? That's also another level of random variance, which I think is probably a bit too confusing. But again, this happens before your critical decision points. But it then can also be changed and influenced by those actions that you can take once you have agency.
I think your critical decision point is you positioning your heroes and your creeps, though.
Well, right, but you haven't done that yet.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about when you deploy the
Right,
thing
right.
and
Okay,
picks the
so
output.
we're talking
and-
about initial game layout.
Right.
Your initial board state is randomized, and now you are reacting to that variance.
Right. Okay.
Then on future turns,
Yes.
either your heroes have been destroyed, sent back to the fountain, which is a MOBA thing,
Yeah.
and then, or you have drawn. Like I think you then get 2 other heroes to deploy later because there's only 3 on the board.
You
right?
get
When you
2
start-
to deploy, I think, on your second
right.
turn at the start of your second hero deployment or whatever.
There is a bit of behind the scenes consistency here in that your heroes come back from the fountain every after 2 turns, right?
I think so.
Or on the second turn, they skip a turn, I think.
I think so.
So you can understand, like, if you wrap your head around how that system is working, you are in control a bit of when you are able to redeploy your heroes, and this is a very high skill thing in that I think part of the issue here with the randomness is that players it's not obvious where you can control the variance. That's like I feel like it's reversed, right? It should be obvious where you can have your impacts, and the RNG should be less obvious.
Right.
But they've sort of got them flip-flopped here, where it's hard for you to tell where your actions are having impact and where the randomness is having impact.
It feels a little bit more like when you, like, for instance, when I'm making a decision and I'm playing Magic, right? If I'm casting Lightning Bolt, unless the opponent has untapped mana, I generally know my spell is going to go through, I'm going to deal 3 damage, and I get to decide where that 3 damage is going. But in Artifact, I'm playing a card, I hope it goes where I really want it to go. And, like,
Right.
it's your decisions that then you're, like, hedging your bets against that, which
Right.
feels strange.
Well, a lot of the places where you have agency is more in terms of like, okay, and this is why there's 3 boards, I think, is that you can sort of have this feeling of I'm not winning this battle, so I'm going to abandon it and move to these other 2 to try to win. Like you have this ability to dynamically move between lanes of how you're going to win the game,
Which can be interesting.
I think that's the best part of Artifact.
I like being able to, like, you kind of hold someone off and, like, you can bait that you're going to go one way. And then
I think that's where a lot of the bluffing can come in here is that you're like, okay, which lane am I actually invested in?
Yeah.
And that's a lot of where the mastery comes from. One of the things about this control that you actually have over the agency is in your hero. So when you go to deploy your hero, it shows up. You can choose what lane it's going to go into, but you don't know where it's going to land in that lane, right? So that, again, like, this feels very much like output randomness. But I might argue still that this is still input randomness.
regardless of whether it's output or input,
It feels bad.
it feels bad.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think what ends up feeling bad about it is, I think you're right in that it flips back and forth, right? A little too quickly, where you have input and then it's an output to that input, and then it's input again, and then it's output again.
Yes.
And we've compared this to Hearthstone Battlegrounds, where auto chess games, the way that most of them function is there's this very, very clear separation between where your input values are and your output is. And your input is, and where your strategy lies, is how you're drafting the things that you're drafting, how you're positioning them, and getting ready for the next round. And then how well you do is based off of your strategic decisions of what you did. But it's all output as far as how you do that thing.
Right. So, in Battlegrounds, the shop shows up. There's input randomness there with what shows up in the shop. You purchase what you want, so you have control over. You were responding to that variance. You place it where you want it to go, and then you say okay, and you go to the match, and then it's you had agency over placing the units in what order they're going to attack, but you don't know where they're going to attack.
Yeah.
But you do also have some control over where your opponents are going to attack because you can get taunt minions and things like that.
Right.
So it feels like there's this back and forth and influence over the variance that I feel like Artifact has, but in order to get there, the layers to get there are very unclear.
Yeah.
And that with Battlegrounds, it's very clear when like these are my actions that I have agency over. These are actions I don't have agency over.
And I think the reason that we are bringing up Battlegrounds is because in Hearthstone Battlegrounds, like that is a game that a lot of people enjoy. Arguably, like a lot of people are playing that more than standard, at least based off of if you watch people on Twitch. Like no one complains. Like some people complain about it. They're like, oh, I really wanted it to attack Baron Rivendare or whatever. But like for the most part, it's the type of output that you're like, oh, that sucks. And then you move on. Right. Whereas Artifact, I'm pretty sure out of every single game that I played, there was almost always at least 1 to 2 moments that I was like, why the hell did it decide to go and attack to the right or go and attack to the left or whatever?
Right. The randomness in like what direction things are attacking in is probably the one that's the hardest for me to wrap my head around.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there was a good reason for it. And I wish that we could, talk to whoever made that decision so that we could get a bit more insight. But from an outside perspective, at this point, it's hard for me to justify that one.
I think that, right. And I think what's good to point out is I think you'll hear from a lot of, especially a lot of pro TCG players and a lot of players in general, that their perspective, the minute that people learn about input and output randomness, almost always people are like, oh, output's bad. Right. Oh, like output's bad. Like I'm never going to put output in my game. Yeah. And like you can point to so many different games that have effective output randomness that is fun and is interesting and still has strategic depth. And I think Hearthstone Battlegrounds is like a really good example of that.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I think the thing to keep in mind here is that all of these things are tools and they all create different feelings in players. It's not really that anything is necessarily good or bad. It's that, it's all a way to tell different stories.
Right.
I think for me, in terms of the presentation of the randomness in Artifact, the lessons that my takeaway from this particular aspect of Artifact is that, for me, designing a game is a bit like designing a clock in that, the gears and the systems and the mechanisms at work are under the surface, right? They're moving in unison and doing their jobs, and the player doesn't need to be so aware of what's going on back there. They're just looking at the clock face and seeing what time it is, right? Yeah. So when you reveal too much of these underlying systems, or if you put them in places where they're too obvious, players will reject what's going on there. Yeah. They'll see too much of the mechanisms at work. And I think that really advanced players appreciate this, maybe in the same way that there are like, gearheads who love to be able to see all the gears and stuff working on a motorcycle or something, right? Where you can really see everything when it's working in motion. And I think advanced players can utilize that information to maybe make better decisions or have more decision points where they can interact with the game. But a more casual audience is really just it just looks like gears. It just looks like stuff moving, and you don't know what the outcome is. Yeah. And so keeping that outcome very clear, I think, to me, at least in this aspect of Artifact, that's a lesson that I take away from it.